Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably, and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through the woods, where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? The Vanishing Hitchhiker of Snowy Route 66. It was the winter of 2016, late December, when Mike and his girlfriend, Jenna, decided to take a road trip from Albuquerque, New Mexico, to Flagstaff, Arizona. Route 66, though no longer a primary highway, had always intrigued Mike with its nostalgia and eerie reputation. Snow blanketed the desert landscape, giving the familiar stretch of road an otherworldly feel. The couple set off around 4 p.m., hoping to reach their motel in Flagstaff by midnight. The sun dipped below the horizon early, leaving the sky a dusky purple. Cold winds howled against their old Jeep Wrangler as it cruised down the nearly deserted highway. Around 9 p.m., as they passed through a stretch of forest near the Arizona state line, Jenna spotted something ahead. A figure stood by the side of the road, waving one arm weakly. Mike slowed the Jeep, his brows furrowing. "Should we stop?" Jenna asked hesitantly, clutching her jacket closer to her. The figure was a young woman, barely dressed for the biting cold. She wore a thin white dress that clung to her, and her long black hair cascaded over her pale face. "She must be freezing," Mike replied. He pulled over, rolling down the window slightly. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman stepped closer. Her voice was soft, almost drowned out by the wind. "I need a ride to the next town." Mike and Jenna exchanged a glance. "Hop in," Mike said cautiously, unlocking the door. The woman slid into the back seat, her presence immediately filling the Jeep with an unnatural chill. Jenna turned around to look at her, but the woman's face remained obscured by her hair. "Where exactly are you headed?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling slightly. The woman paused for a long moment before answering, "Just keep driving. I'll tell you when we're there." The couple felt uneasy, but decided not to press further. The road stretched on, flanked by towering pine trees dusted with snow. The GPS signal was patchy, and the only sound was the crunch of tires on icy pavement. After several miles of silence, Jenna turned again to check on their passenger, but the back seat was empty. "Mike!" Jenna screamed, her voice cracking. "She's gone!" Mike slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. He turned around, expecting to see the woman sprawled on the road behind them, but there was nothing. Only snow-covered asphalt and the dark forest beyond. "What the hell?" Mike muttered, stepping out of the Jeep. The freezing air bit at his skin, but he didn't care. He scanned the area, his breath visible in the icy night. That's when Jenna noticed it. A faint set of footprints in the snow leading away from the road, disappearing into the woods. "Mike, don't follow them," she pleaded. "Let's just go, please." But Mike was already moving toward the trees, flashlight in hand. Stories 2. Whispers in the White Forest. A Winter's Tale. It was the 3rd of January 2019 when James Carter, a 34-year-old freelance photographer, drove up to the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. His goal was to capture the untouched beauty of the snow-covered forest for a nature magazine. Winter storms had passed a few days prior, leaving the area draped in a pristine, sparkling white. James arrived at a small cabin he had rented just outside Saranac Lake around 3 p.m. The air was cold and crisp, with the temperature hovering around 15°F, As he unpacked his camera gear, he noticed the forest seemed unusually quiet. No birds, no rustling branches, just the faint crunch of snow beneath his boots. By 4 p.m., the sun was already beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. He decided to head into the forest immediately. Hoping to make the most of the golden hour, the narrow path leading from the cabin was lined with towering pines whose branches sagged under the weight of the snow. As James walked deeper into the woods, the silence became oppressive. Every step he took felt amplified, the sound of his boots crunching the snow echoing unnaturally. He stopped to adjust his camera settings when he heard a faint, whispering sound. It was distant, almost like a breeze moving through the trees, but there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. James paused, tilting his head. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sharp against the quiet. The whispers stopped. He scanned the area, but the fading light made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Shrugging it off, he assumed it was his imagination and continued down the trail. By 5 p.m., the forest was cloaked in darkness, save for the dim glow of the moonlight reflecting off the snow. James decided it was time to head back. As he turned around, he felt a subtle shift in the air. Behind him, barely visible in the shadow of the trees, stood a figure. "Hey, who's there?" he called, his voice firm but laced with fear. The figure didn't move. It appeared to be a person draped in a dark, tattered cloak, blending into the shadows. "Look, if you are lost, I can help," James said, trying to steady his breathing. Still, no response. James took a step closer, his flashlight illuminating the space, but the figure was gone. The snow where it had been standing was undisturbed. That's when the whispers returned. Louder this time, surrounding him. Panic set in. James began walking quickly, his eyes darting between the trees. The whispers seemed to grow closer, more urgent, as if they were calling his name. He broke into a run, the camera bouncing against his chest. The trail was harder to follow in the dark, and he tripped over a hidden route, sprawling face first into the snow. As he scrambled to his feet, he saw it again, the figure. This time, it was closer. Its face obscured by the hood, its presence was suffocating. Stories 3. The Frozen Cabin and the Stranger Who Knocked at Midnight. It was a brutally cold January night in 2017 when Sarah Thompson, a 29-year-old novelist, checked into a remote rental cabin in the heart of Montana's Bitterroot Mountains. Seeking solitude to finish her latest manuscript, she had chosen the cabin for its isolation. It was a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and the rental company had warned her about the patchy cell service in the area. She arrived at the cabin just before sunset, around 5 p.m. Snow blanketed the ground in thick, unbroken layers, and the temperature was dropping, rapidly forecasted to hit -10 -4F, 23 -4C overnight. The cabin was small but cozy, with a wood-burning stove, a single bedroom, and large windows that framed the endless white wilderness. By 8 p.m., Sarah had settled in. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She sipped hot cocoa while typing away on her laptop, the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Despite the cabin's charm, the silence outside felt heavy, as if the world had been muted. Around 11:45 p.m., she decided to call it a night. She had just turned off the lights and was climbing into bed when she heard a faint knock at the front door. Her heart skipped. The cabin was miles from civilization, and no one should have been out there, especially at this hour. The knock came again, louder this time. Sarah grabbed her phone, but as expected, there was no signal. She hesitated before walking toward the door, her slippers barely making a sound on the wooden floor. Peering through the peephole, she saw a man standing in the snow, shivering violently. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a scruffy beard and a tattered parka. His face was pale, and his lips were almost blue. "Please, I need help," he said, his voice muffled through the door. Sarah hesitated. Letting a stranger in during a snowstorm felt dangerous, but she couldn't just leave him out there to freeze. "Are you alone?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes. My car broke down about a mile back," he replied. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough for him to step inside. The cold rushed in with him, stinging her cheeks. "Thank you," the man muttered, slumping into a chair near the fire. Sarah handed him a blanket and poured him a cup of tea, all the while keeping a cautious distance. "What were you doing out here so late?" she asked. He stared into the fire for a moment before answering. "I was home from Missoula. Took a wrong turn, I think." Something about his story didn't sit right with her. Missoula was hours away, and there weren't many roads to get lost on out here. As the minutes passed, the man's shivering subsided, but his presence began to feel heavier, more oppressive. He hadn't removed his coat or boots, and his gaze remained fixed on the flames. Then, without warning, he turned to her and smiled at a cold, unnatural smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You shouldn't have let me in," he said softly. Sarah's blood ran cold. Footsteps on the icy road. A silent pursuit. In late December 2018, Emma Collins, a 26-year-old college graduate, was driving home to Denver, Colorado, after spending Christmas with her family in Casper, Wyoming. The snowstorm that had been forecasted arrived earlier than expected, blanketing Interstate 25 with a thick layer of ice and snow. By 9 p.m., visibility had dropped to near zero. Emma decided to take an alternate route through a rural highway, hoping to avoid the heavy traffic. She knew it would add an hour to her trip, but the thought of crawling along the interstate in a blizzard seemed worse. The rural road was eerily quiet. No streetlights, no passing cars, just her Subaru's headlights cutting through the swirling snow. The rhythmic thudding of her tires on the icy pavement was the only sound keeping her company. At 9:45 p.m., her GPS lost signal, and her phone's battery was down to 12%. The road seemed endless, flanked by dense woods on either side. She tried to reassure herself that she was on the right track, even though unease began to creep in. Then, she saw them footprints in the snow, illuminated by her headlights. They appeared suddenly in the middle of the road, trailing off toward the trees. Emma's stomach tightened. There was no vehicle in sight, no sign of anyone walking ahead. The footprints looked fresh, unblemished by falling snow. She slowed the car, leaning forward to peer into the darkness. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere? She muttered to herself. As she debated whether to keep driving, a sharp knock startled her. It came from the passenger side window. Emma's heart leapt into her throat as she whipped her head toward the sound. The window was fogged over, but she could make out the faint outline of a handprint smeared against the glass. She froze, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The handprint was small, almost childlike. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came another knock, this time from the driver's side. Emma screamed, slamming her foot on the gas. The Subaru lurched forward, skidding slightly on the icy road before regaining traction. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees on either side forming a tunnel of shadows. Her chest heaved as she tried to calm her breathing, but the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. At 10:15 p.m., she reached a sharp bend in the road. As her headlights swept across the curve, she saw it's a figure standing in the middle of the road ahead. It was a woman wearing a tattered, pale dress that fluttered unnaturally in the wind. Her hair hung in long, wet strands over her face. Emma slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just feet away from the figure. The woman didn't move. Emma honked the horn, her hands trembling. "Get out of the way!" she yelled. The woman's head tilted slowly, as if she had heard Herbert when she stepped forward. Emma realized something horrifying. The woman's feet weren't touching the ground. Stories 5. The Abandoned Lodge on Black Mountain Pass. In February 2020, David and Rachel Harper, a married couple from Portland, Oregon, decided to take a weekend getaway to the Cascade Mountains. They planned to stay at a remote Airbnb nestled along Black Mountain Pass, a scenic route known for its towering evergreens and breathtaking views. The lodge was advertised as rustic yet charming, perfect for couples seeking isolation. They arrived just after 3 p.m. on a Friday, the winter sun already sinking behind the mountains. The driveway was barely plowed and their tires crunched over the packed snow. The lodge was beautiful, but felt off. The red paint on the exterior was peeling, and several windows were boarded up. "It's probably just an old building," Rachel said, trying to dismiss the unease settling in her chest. Inside, the air was cold, and there was a faint, musty smell. The electricity worked, but only in certain rooms. A handwritten note on the kitchen counter caught Rachel's eye. Asterisk. Keep the fire burning at all times. Don't let it go out. Asterisk. That's weird, David muttered, reading over her shoulder. By 7 p.m., the temperature had dropped to 10 DU4F, 12 DU4C. The couple sat near the roaring fireplace, sipping hot chocolates and playing cards. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Occasionally, they heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch, but every time David checked, no one was there. "It's probably just the wind," Rachel suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. At 10 p.m., they decided to call it a night. The bedroom was upstairs, and as they climbed the creaky staircase, Rachel noticed something strange. The smell of smoke. "David, did you leave the fireplace open?" she asked. "No, I closed it," he replied, frowning. The smell grew stronger as they reached the top of the stairs. To their horror, the smoke wasn't coming from the living room, it was seeping out from under a door at the end of the hallway. "That room's locked," Rachel whispered, her heart pounding. David hesitated but walked toward the door. He jiggled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from inside the room, as if something heavy had fallen. They bolted back downstairs, deciding to sleep by the fireplace instead. At midnight, Rachel woke to the sound of faint whispers. She sat up, her breath visible in the frigid air. The fire had nearly died out, casting the room in shadows. "David!" she hissed, shaking him awake. Before he could respond, there was a loud knock at the front door. Then another, and another. David grabbed the poker from the fireplace and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he shouted. No answer. He peeked through the peephole but saw nothing except swirling snow. When he opened the door, the porch was empty, but a single set of footprints led away from the lodge, disappearing into the dark forest. "Someone's out there?" David said, his voice tense. As they debated whether to leave or stay, they heard it again, the banging from the locked room upstairs. This time, it was followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps descending the staircase. Story 6. Shadows Beneath the Snowstorm. In early December 2021, Olivia Reed, a 32-year-old wildlife biologist from Anchorage, Alaska, was tasked with a winter field study deep in the remote wilderness of Denali National Park. She was studying the migration patterns of caribou and had set up a small research outpost, a weathered cabin, surrounded by miles of untouched snow. On the morning of the 12th of December, a blizzard rolled in unexpectedly. By noon, the wind was howling, and visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. Trapped inside, Olivia monitored her instruments and jotted notes by the glow of a propane lamp. The cabin was sturdy but old, and the storm made it creak and groan as if it were alive. By 4 p.m., the temperature had plummeted to -20 DU4F, 29 DU4C, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Olivia tried to radio her team, but the static was deafening. Around 6 p.m., as she was preparing a simple dinner, she noticed something strange. The snow outside the window seemed disturbed, as if something or someone had been moving around. At first, she thought it might be a caribou, but the pattern in the snow wasn't right. It looked like footprints, human footprints. "Impossible," she muttered, peering out into the swirling snow. She was miles away from any human settlement, and no one on her team would be foolish enough to travel in such weather. By 8 p.m., the storm grew even fiercer. The wind was now a relentless roar, and the cabin shuddered with each gust. Olivia tried to distract herself with work, but a sudden thud on the roof made her jump. She froze, listening intently. The sound didn't repeat, but her heart was racing. She told herself it was probably a branch or a clump of snow dislodged by the wind. At 10 p.m., as she sat by the fire, She heard it again, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps outside. This time, it was close. Grabbing her flashlight, Olivia crept to the window. The beam of light cut through the snowstorm, illuminating the area just beyond the porch. Her breath caught. Standing just beyond the cabin's perimeter was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and cloaked in what appeared to be tattered, snow-covered rags. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Olivia could feel its gaze piercing through the storm. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. The figure didn't move. Suddenly, the propane lamp flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Olivia's flashlight wavered in her trembling hand. When she shone it back outside, the figure was gone. The wind howled louder, and the cabin felt colder, as if the storm itself had seeped inside. Olivia locked the door and grabbed her radio again, desperately calling for help. Static. Then, over the crackling noise, she heard something chilling. A whisper. "Let me in." Her blood ran cold. The whisper wasn't coming from the radio, it was coming from right behind her. Next stories. The vanishing lights of Silent Creek. It was the 23rd of December, 2016, when Eric Matthews, a 37-year-old delivery driver from Boise, Idaho, found himself driving a late-night route through the snowy backroads of Silent Creek. His task was to deliver a package to a remote lodge just outside the small mountain town of Ashton, Idaho. The snowstorm had started hours earlier, turning the narrow roads into treacherous paths. By 9 p.m., the world outside his truck was a blur of white, and the temperature had plunged to single digits. Eric gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale as he navigated the winding road. The forest on either side of the road was dense, the trees heavy with snow. Every so often, he thought he saw movement in the shadows, branches swaying or shapes darting between the trees, but he told himself it was just the storm playing tricks on his eyes. At 9:30 p.m., his headlights caught something unusual. Up ahead, several dim, flickering lights appeared in the middle of the road. Eric slowed the truck, squinting to get a better look. The lights were small and scattered, resembling lanterns swaying gently in the wind. He rolled down his window slightly, letting the icy air bite at his face, but he couldn't hear anything over the howling storm. As he approached, the lights began to fade, one by one, until only darkness remained. Confused and uneasy, Eric stopped the truck and stepped out, his boots crunching in the snow. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the storm. No response. He shone his flashlight around the area, but saw no sign of the lights or anyone who might have been carrying them. The road ahead was empty, the snow untouched. Eric got back into his truck, his breath visible in the freezing air. He decided to keep moving, chalking up the strange lights to exhaustion or the storm. By 10 p.m., he was deep in the forest, with no cell service and no sign of the lodge. His GPS had stopped working, and the only sound was the hum of the truck engine and the relentless wind. Then the lights reappeared. This time, they were closer. A cluster of them danced along the side of the road, casting faint, eerie glows on the snow. Eric's stomach churned. These weren't headlights, lanterns, or anything he could recognize. The lights seemed to pulse and flicker as if they were alive. He slowed down again, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But before he could act, the truck's engine sputtered and died, plunging him into silence. "Come on, don't do this now," he muttered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. The engine refused to start. The lights grew brighter, circling the truck now. Eric locked the doors, his breathing rapid. He could see them clearly. Each light seemed to float on its own, with no source, no person holding them. And then he heard it, a faint tapping on the driver's side window. Next stories. The snow-covered trail that led to nowhere. It was late January 2019 when Samantha Sam Carter, a 28-year-old photographer from Boulder, Colorado, set out to capture winter landscapes in Rocky Mountain National Park. She had planned her trip carefully, packing her camera gear, snowshoes, and a thermos of hot tea. The park was quiet that time of year, with most visitors deterred by the freezing temperatures. By 2 p.m., she had parked her Jeep at a nearly empty trailhead. The forecast warned of snow flurries in the evening, but she figured she'd have plenty of time to hike a few miles, take some photos, and return before dark. The trail was breathtaking. Snow-laden evergreens lined the path, and the air was crisp and still. The only sound was the crunch of her snowshoes against the frozen ground. Sam paused often to take pictures, marveling at the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. By 4 p.m., the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the snow. Sam decided to turn back, not wanting to be caught on the trail after dark. But as she retraced her steps, she noticed something strange. Her footprints, fresh and unmistakable on the way out, were gone. The snow was undisturbed, as if no one had walked there at all. A wave of unease swept over her, but she shook it off. The wind must have covered them, she muttered, though the air had been completely still. She continued walking, her eyes scanning the trail for familiar landmarks. After what felt like an hour, she realized something was wrong. The trees looked unfamiliar, and the path seemed narrower, overgrown with snow-dusted bushes. Her GPS refused to load, and her phone's battery had dwindled to 5%. By 5:30 p.m., the sky was an inky black, and the temperature had dropped sharply. Sam turned on her headlamp, the narrow beam of light cutting through the darkness. The forest felt different now, silent and oppressive, as if it were watching her. Suddenly, she spotted footprints in the snow ahead. Relief washed over her. Maybe someone else was on the trail and could help her find the way back. But as she got closer, her stomach sank. The footprints weren't moving away from her, they were coming toward her. And they stopped abruptly, just a few feet ahead, in the middle of the trail. There was no one there. Sam's breath quickened, forming clouds in the icy air. She swung her headlamp around, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with snow. Then she heard it, a faint voice, whispering her name. Sam? Her heart pounded as she turned in the direction of the sound. It was distant but unmistakable, coming from deeper into the woods. Who's there? She called, her voice trembling. No answer. The whisper came again, closer this time. Sam, this way. Against her better judgment, she followed the sound, stepping off the trail and into the dense forest. The snow was deeper here, making it harder to walk. The voice grew louder, more insistent. Sam, hurry. Her headlamp flickered, casting erratic shadows. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees pressing closer. And then she saw a figure standing in the distance. It was barely visible, shrouded in shadow, but it seemed to be beckoning her. Help me, Sam shouted, desperate. The figure didn't move, but the whisper came again, chilling her to the bone. You are almost here. Next stories. The Forgotten Cabin in the Endless Snow. It was a cold, clear evening in late November 2020 when Jake and Sarah Williams, a couple from Salt Lake City, Utah, decided to take a weekend getaway to the Wasatch Mountains. They had heard about a secluded cabin that had been available for rent on a remote trail, far from any crowded ski resorts or noisy towns. The promise of a quiet retreat was exactly what they needed after a stressful year. The drive up was smooth at first, the roads still passable despite the early snowstorms. As the sun set around 5 p.m., a thick layer of snow had already covered the ground, making everything look pristine and untouched. But as they reached a fork in the road, Sarah noticed something strange. There were no signs or markers indicating the correct direction to the cabin. Just an old, weathered wooden post leaning to one side. Jake shrugged. We've got the GPS. It'll be fine. They took the left path, winding deeper into the woods. The air was crisp and the snow crunched beneath their tires. The road became narrower and more isolated, and soon their phone signals faded completely. At 7 p.m., they finally arrived at the cabin. The building appeared ancient, its dark wood blending with the snowy landscape. The windows were dark, and the door, although slightly ajar, looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. This is it? Sarah asked, eyeing the dilapidated structure. Jake smiled reassuringly. It's rustic, just like the ad said. Let's make the best of it. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by the glow of a small, flickering lantern that had been left on a table by the door. The air was cold, but it wasn't unbearable. There were 2 rooms, a living area with a stone fireplace and a small kitchen. The decor was old-fashioned, with faded wallpaper and wooden furniture. It felt like stepping into the past. As they unpacked, Sarah noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the snow leading to the front door, but none leading away. Did someone just leave? She asked, pointing to the tracks. Jake frowned. Maybe? Or maybe the wind blew some snow onto the path. It's hard to tell with the storm. They decided to settle in for the night. The wind howled outside, and the snowstorm grew stronger, rattling the cabin's walls. By 10 p.m., they had the fire roaring in the hearth, and the warmth of the flames seemed to keep the growing sense of unease at bay. But as they sat in front of the fire, Sarah heard a sound, something soft and deliberate. A slow, dragging noise coming from the upstairs. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes darting toward the staircase. Jake nodded, looking confused. "Probably just the wind. The house is old, it makes noises." But the sound persisted. It was faint, but it was unmistakable, like someone was slowly dragging something heavy across the floor upstairs. Sarah stood up, her heart racing. "I am going to check it out." Jake grabbed her arm. "Don't. Let's just stay down here, okay?" But Sarah pulled away, determined to find the source. She crept upstairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath her weight. At the top of the stairs, there was a long, dark hallway with a single door at the end. The dragging sound was louder now, almost rhythmic. She reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling. The door creaked open, and Sarah froze. The room was empty. No one was there. But the dragging noise stopped the instant the door swung open. Confused and unsettled, she returned downstairs. But as soon as she stepped into the living room, the door slammed shut behind her. The fire sputtered out, leaving only embers. The room grew cold, much colder than before. Next stories. The Silent Caller in the Snowstorm. On the evening of the 16th of January, 2018, Amanda Davis, a 26-year-old college student from Seattle, Washington, set off on a winter road trip to visit her parents in Spokane. The forecast had warned of heavy snowstorms, but Amanda, eager to get home for the holidays, decided to go ahead with the drive. She had packed her car with blankets, snacks, and a playlist of her favorite songs to keep her company on the long journey. By 8 p.m., the storm had intensified. The roads, slick with ice, were barely visible through the thick veil of snow. Amanda's windshield wipers worked overtime as she drove along the I-90 east, the only sound in the car being the hum of the tires against the snow-packed highway. At around 9 p.m., Amanda's phone buzzed with a call. It was from an unknown number. She hesitated but answered it, thinking it might be a friend checking in on her. "Hello?" she said, her voice tentative. There was silence on the other end. Then, after a long pause, a whisper came through the speaker. "Amanda." Her heart skipped a beat. She froze for a moment, not knowing if she had imagined it. "Hello? Who is this?" she asked again, her voice slightly shakier. The voice didn't respond. Instead, there was a strange static noise, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible sound like footsteps crunching in the snow. Amanda's pulse quickened. "Hello? I don't appreciate this. Who is this?" she repeated, her eyes scanning the road for any sign of another vehicle. The footsteps continued, louder now, closer. "Stop the car, Amanda," the voice said suddenly, its tone cold and commanding. Amanda's blood ran cold. She looked out the window, her breath fogging up the glass. There was no one around, just miles of snow-covered highway and the howling wind. She could see no cars, no lights, no signs of life. "Stop the car, Amanda. You are almost there," the voice repeated, its whisper now clearer. Panicked, Amanda slammed her foot down on the accelerator, her car speeding through the storm. She glanced at the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of anything behind her, only snow and darkness. The phone call ended abruptly. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, but the silence of the car was even more unnerving now. She checked her phone and no missed calls or voicemails. But the number, it had been a blocked one. By 9:30 p.m., Amanda reached a rest stop near Cle, a small town in Washington. The storm had worsened, and she needed to stop for fuel. As she pulled into the deserted station, she noticed something odd. There was a set of fresh footprints leading from the gas station to her car, as if someone had been standing just behind her vehicle, watching her. Her stomach dropped. She quickly filled up the tank, looking over her shoulder every few seconds, expecting someone to appear. But no one came. As she got back into her car and prepared to leave, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from the unknown number. "I told you to stop. Now you've made me wait." Amanda's hands shook as she dropped the phone into the passenger seat. The storm outside was relentless, but she couldn't drive fast enough. The sensation of being followed, of being watched, weighed heavily on her, and she found herself glancing nervously into the side mirrors. As she pulled back onto the highway, she noticed something in the rearview mirror's shadow, moving fast, impossibly fast, like something was chasing her through the storm.